We are very, very honored to be joined by Daniel Sugarman, straight from London, where all the action is at right now, the Director of Public Affairs for the Board of Jewish Deputies of Jewish Organizations in the UK. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you for being here. So, can you share with us what the feel is like? What's the feeling like on this coronation weekend? What does it feel like to be in London?
Well, it feels wonderful. The sun is now shining. It was raining pretty heavily yesterday where I was, so I can only assume it was raining pretty heavily in the center of town where the coronation was taking place. But the mood is happy. I think it wasn't so easy last year when the Queen, of course, passed away. I think a lot of people were very sad, very moved. Of course, the Queen was Queen for all of my life, most people's lives, and people felt very close to her, and people are happy now that Charles has been crowned, and we of course wish him the very best of success.
Wow. Okay. So, since coronations do not happen frequently, it's hard to speak about the history of coronations and the Jewish community in a world that changes so fast. But it seemed like this coronation was a very Jewish one. The chief rabbi there, there were many, many Jewish aspects, Jews, standing to greet the king. Can you elaborate on the relationship between the crown and the Jewish community, and why all this enthusiasm to our American viewers who don't necessarily share the same experience of a monarchy?
Of course. Well, I guess that the first thing I should say is that the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the organization I represent, was founded in 1760. So right about the sort of time where the first rumblings were starting to come out in Boston and Philadelphia and various other places. The Jewish community in this country has traditionally had a pretty close relationship to the royal family in terms
Mhm.
of just very patriotic. And I mean there's some small things as well. For instance, the royal males generally used to get circumcised by a Jewish mohel,
By
etc.
the way, I
etc.
gave a talk about it this Shabbos in Shul,
Oh,
and someone called it the Royal Moil. But
exactly,
yes.
yeah, so the relationship is quite a close one, and um, the Queen, when she was with us, but also Prince Charles, is also the tends to be patron of a number of charities, including some of those charities are within the Jewish community when it comes to, for example, charities for Holocaust remembrance and Holocaust survivors. And the royal family has really gone out of its way over the years to invite the Jewish community, in particular. I used to be a journalist and I covered some of these events, to invite Holocaust survivors to the palace and to hear the stories, and a lot of goodwill is there. So I think that
Mhm.
that has definitely made a huge difference. But also I think that you're right in terms of the coronation this time round being more Jewish, shall we say, than previously. I think that that really reflects the world that we now live in, and it really was a sort of coronation for the 21st century. So, in terms of the Jewish guests that were there, of course, the chief rabbi, everyone knows, was there and took part in a when the king exited the abbey at the end of the coronation. The chief rabbi was among religious leaders representing a number of different religions that gave a sort of blessing to the king. No microphones were involved for any of the participants, but even if there had been for others, the chief rabbi would not have worn one, of course. But also in terms of other Jewish people that were there, of course, the president of our organization, Marie van der Zil, was there. The senior rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese congregation S&P Sephardi community, which is the oldest community in Britain, uh, an American, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, was there, and the former chief executive of our charity, someone called Baroness Merrin, was there and actually took part in the ceremony
Mhm.
in a small way. And I think that it was it was special to a lot of people as well. And I won't go into it too much right now because of other questions that may arise. But also when one considers some of the history with coronations and the Jewish community going further back in time, because of course the relationship for Jews in England has not always been quite so rosy.
Hmm. Well, the size also of the community now is are you? I'm not sure. Are you guys the largest in Europe or second largest? Either way, it's a very big. The Jewish community is much larger than it used to be.
The Jewish community in England, in the UK, I should say, is roughly, and give or take, but roughly around 300,000. It's the second largest in Europe. I think France is larger. But yes, it's a large community for Europe these days, of course, and a proud community. It's got we came back to the country in, I think, 1656 when we were invited back in. So there are a few hundred years there. And of course,
Charles the Second, I think.
Just before Charles II, it was Oliver
Oliver
Cromwell.
Cromwell. I just was talking
eh,
to Rabbi Penny Dunner. I'm sure you know about it, and he said it's interesting because Oliver Cromwell brought the Jews back, and then when Charles II came, even though he sort of rescinded a lot of Cromwell's policies, he kept the part of the Jews allowed to come back.
That's absolutely correct. And I mean, it would be fascinating to go into all the history of the Jewish community around then, and to talk about some of the really fascinating bits that took place. Of course, Oliver Cromwell, the main argument that I think Rabbi Menashe ben Israel made, who was of course from the Amsterdam community, was an appeal to the sort of Christian enthusiasm of Oliver Cromwell in terms of the Jews needed to be Arba Compass, or all four corners before the
Mhm.
Messiah, or as we would think of it, Mashiach, but as they would think of it, someone else would return. So it was an appeal to religious sympathies, and it worked. So.
Right. It's interesting because the monarchy is an institution that's hard to understand from the perspective of the United States because it's a position that's very symbolic but doesn't have much actual power to it. And I think just one thing that strikes me in this coronation is that in a way it's being used to bring the different parts of British society together. I know Rabbi Sachs was very busy with the home we build together and the topic of a British that is increasingly diverse. Do you also see that way? Was this coronation a way of sort of bringing together increasingly diverse Britain around sort of a common theme?
I think that there's definitely a lot to that, and I completely understand for most Americans as well. When people think of the monarchy, thinking of bad old King George III and the attempts to successful attempts to overthrow the tyranny of British rule. There's definitely was an element with this coronation, but in general of bringing the country together, and for 500 and something years, one of the titles that's been held by the monarch, by the English monarch, is Defender of the Faith. That was the title given originally, I think, to Henry VIII by the Pope before Henry VIII decided to split away from Catholicism. But King Charles, has made it clear that he wants to be the defender of all the faiths, not just Christianity, which means a lot, I think, to non-Christians.
Oh, so he said this explicitly. This was wow, very nice. And so, are you seeing? It's kind of too soon, but are you seeing a day later? Are you seeing this impact? Is there a sort of a better sense of unity in the country? Is the intention lasting? Is it happening?
Well, it's hard to say at this point. I think that people certainly appreciated that the coronation was, while of course very Christian, and that was always going to be the case, taking place in Westminster Abbey, and it's a very Christian ceremony, of course, the coronation. The effort that was made to include others more widely is definitely been noticed. I think in terms of general society, I think some people's views are mixed, like anywhere else. Some people are very interested in the coronation and very pro the royal family, and some people some people couldn't really care less. That's how it is in a democracy. Different people. Some people strongly support something. Other people might not. But I think in general, the mood of the country is, we wish King Charles, a long and happy reign.
All right. Yes, I join you in that. Another news item that was reported is the oil was, first of all, it's just fascinating as someone who teaches Bible. The oil, the anointing is done in private, which is sort of supposed to echo, I think, the way King David, both King David and King Saul are anointed by Samuel. And another interesting fact is the oil's from Jerusalem.
That's correct. So of course, as you've alluded to, the anointing, which has been a part of the coronation ceremony for 1,000 years, or it gets its origin, of course, from the Bible, from I think.
By the way, it's interesting. The word Mashiach literally just means the one,
the anointed one.
Yeah, the word for cream in Hebrew is mishcha, which means something you put on yourself. But yeah, Mashiach is the anointing.
Fascinating. Of course, Mashiach is the anointing, and the English version of that being Messiah. But 1,000 years of this tradition, which of course comes directly from we as we know at the book of Shmuel, Samuel, and book of Kings, Melachim, and during the ceremony, one of the most famous pieces of music, which is sung as part of the coronation, was by a German composer who lived in England and composed it for all these pieces for the coronation of George II, is directly taken from Melachim, from Kings, where it talks about Zadok, Tzadok, the priest, and Nathan, Nosson, the prophet, who anointed Solomon as king, and that is sung as and it's a direct sort of link that the idea. The crowning is of course a very, very important part. The anointing is the holiest part of the ceremony, and as was done yesterday, it's done behind a screen. It's not seen by the general public. And yes, the oil was brought from Har HaZetim, the Mount of Olives. I believe it was brought from the same area where the king's grandmother is actually buried. The king's grandmother, as you may very well be aware, is one of the righteous among the nations.
Yeah.
And she helped shelter Jews during the war.
So is that a statement against BDS that the oil is made in Jerusalem, or?
I don't think it was a specific statement against BDS. I think that I could be wrong, but I think that for a while now, the oil has been sourced from Jerusalem, dating back for a while. And I think that it was felt that this was a particularly holy place, which of course it is, Jerusalem, to source it from.
Wow. Okay, and then just obviously this is a very festive moment in British society, but the overall picture in terms of how British Jews are feeling now. King Charles has been very gracious to the Jews, but the state of Jewry, that's the name of the podcast, The Jewish World, the state of Jewry in Britain, what would you say about it now in terms of Jewish life in the UK? How would you what's the state of the union?
Of course. So the first thing, just to clarify, is that I would say that while the general population, some people very, very, pro the royal family and others are ambivalent, I would say that the Jewish community, as we've mentioned, is on the whole is very, very supportive of the monarchy, and of course is very supportive of King Charles. In terms of the general sort of state of the Jewish community, I think it's been a tough few years for everyone. Of course, we had COVID, coronavirus. That was tough for everyone across the world, including the Jewish community in our country. And then there's been in England in particular, in Britain, there's been a sort of financial crisis over the last couple of years, which has been difficult for some people. So it's not been a particularly easy period. But I think that the Jewish community here, like so many other Jewish communities around the world, is very close knit, and the wonderful charities that are part of our community do incredible work in helping people, not just Jewish people, of course, but people from all communities. And I think that people here are confident that, please God, the community here will flourish for many years to come.
Well, they say the grass on the other side is always greener, and definitely on the other side of the pond. I look at the Board of Jewish Deputies and the state of Jewish day schools, which is a cause I've always been very concerned for in the UK, and it seems like just organizationally, maybe I'm missing something. You guys are doing in many ways much better than the United States. The enrollment in day schools, the extent to which a Jewish day school is affordable, the cohesiveness. Obviously, every Jewish community would not really be Jewish if we didn't have our divisions. But in general, the overall cohesiveness of the British community seems to be much, much more healthy than that in America, where there's far greater polarization. Is that an illusion?
So no, that's a fascinating point, and I think actually that part of it is just because we're that much smaller. If we're talking about other person's grass is always greener. I mean, when we look across the pond at the American community, just the sheer size for us is staggering. I mean, you've got almost, I think, three times as many Jews in the tri-state area alone than in the whole
in New York City alone.
Yeah,
I think double. I think Florida is more than double. Would be more than double the UK.
So just the sheer size, and as part of that, the things that I think Jews in America, not in a bad way, of course, take for granted, which Jews in the UK can't. Just in terms of, for example, the wide availability of stuff that's got a hechsher on it. I mean, of course there are many things in this country and many botei dinim who do an excellent job, but just when I've been to America, just the sheer range of possibility is incredible. So in terms of that, it is a smaller community, and I think that sometimes helps to encourage, not always, of course, but encourage some measure of cohesiveness. I think that with regards to the organization I work for instance, we do have a very good way of operating that a lot of other communities just don't, for whatever reason. And it's obviously it's no reflection on the other communities at all. We're incredibly fortunate that we've had however many 100 years in which we've been able to build such a thing without any of the terrible disruptions to Jewish communities that were so old and so incredible. We were, of course, incredibly fortunate not to have to go through that, and that that may also be a part of it.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the history. I think I saw that the Board of Jewish Deputies was founded in preparation for a coronation, for an ascension. So this is really a milestone. I don't know what number coronation is since then, but you guys have been doing coronations for now, I guess, more than 300 years. So
no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. So we mentioned, of course, the Spanish and Portuguese community, which was the first to be founded when Jews were allowed back into this country. So in 1760, when the infamous George III came to the throne, it was a delegation from that community, which was centered around a shul known as Bevis Marks Shul, synagogue in London. A delegation was formed to go to the king and pay homage. And because it was a Spanish and Portuguese community, these delegates were known as deputados. And that's where our name, the Board of Deputies, that's why it's called the Board of Deputies. It's got nothing to do with sheriffs or anything like that, but it dates back to those deputados.
Wow. Well, some of my best friends go to the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue across the park in New York. So definitely familiar, but although they ended up taking a different side on the crown. Actually, interestingly, the Jews, I believe in Rhode Island, were expelled for some time because they were too loyal to the crown. The Toro synagogue, the original, I think they were originally sort of punished for not being more active in going against the crown. But yeah, in general, Jews were very, very loyal to the crown for obvious historical reasons. just in terms of the cohesiveness of the organization. So if you can just speak for a second about who gets a seat, because you're, I think, the only Jewish democratic organization, right? That sort of represents the whole of British Jewry. How does that work?
That's right. So what happens is that we have a couple of hundred member organizations. These are, for example, Jewish charities, many Jewish synagogues, many synagogues around the country. And what happens is those synagogues and organizations that are our members elect deputies from among people who are connected to their organization or synagogue. So those deputies are elected to represent them at the Board of Deputies. And then from among those deputies, every 3 years, there are a series of elections, and a president and a few vice presidents are elected to serve a 3-year term. And in the same way, I guess, as the US presidency has with its 4-year term, a president can only serve 2 consecutive terms, and then that's it. The next election for the Board of Deputies will be taking place next year. And we'll see who becomes president then, because our current president, is in her last term where she can serve. But it is wonderful. We have what we call plenary meetings, roughly around 10 a year, and deputies have the opportunity to talk about various things and sometimes to debate various points. And it is wonderful to have this ability, this democratic organization. And I'm proud of the fact that we have people from around the country, Jewish people, representing their organizations, who can come and can speak, speak their minds, represent their congregation on points which may arise.
Wow. Very interesting. I guess my 2 questions in terms of how that would compare to American organizations: how do you make sure that that's actually a democracy? Meaning, here we have extraordinary amounts of Jewish organizations, but there's very little that would bring different groups of Jews together. You have a conference of presidents, which I'm not sure how that system works, but sometimes when you have organizations, it also depends on donors, as they say in Yiddish. Whoever has the meya has the deya. And so I guess my first question is, how do you make sure that you're representing the Jewish people and Jewish communities rather than donors, organizations, and foundations, etc.? How are you representing people rather than just entities?
That's a very good question. So the first thing to say is that the majority, I believe, of the funding that the Board of Deputies receives comes from the community as a whole. When people pay their synagogue fees on a yearly basis, they have the option to give a little bit more, which goes towards the Board of Deputies. So in terms of, I don't think that there are people, whereas some organizations within the Jewish community, and this is not a criticism in any way, some organizations are perhaps the idea of one specific particularly affluent member of the community who funds it out of his or her own pocket, and the Board of Deputies is not like that at all. And I think that if anyone came to the Board of Deputies and assumed that they would be able to just give money and therefore be able to dictate policy, would go away feeling very disappointed very quickly, because that's not the way that it works, and it hasn't been for. I don't know whether it ever has been, to be fair, but
I must say that's the most un-American idea I've ever heard.
Well,
unfortunately, you have, and it's a good thing, I think. Unfortunately, sometimes what you have not only in America is that the decisions are based on who's giving the most to the organization, which may not necessarily best serve the wider public.
Of course, I can't speak to those organizations, but what I will say is, because it's a democracy and it's a democratic system, the board will say and do things that not everyone in the Jewish community agrees with. being a democratic organization doesn't mean you're going to do what everyone wants all of the time, because that's impossible. Was it Lincoln, who, maybe it was Lincoln, I think, who said, you can't, you no, I'm
Well,
thinking of a different quote. That's a different quote. Sorry.
pleasing most of the people most of the
Yeah,
time.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's not, so it's
Mhm.
when it comes to decisions that the board makes, sometimes certain people will not be happy and will say, look, that decision was made and that's not what I believe. And that's not what I think, and you're not representing me with that. And of course, people are entitled to say that and entitled to think that. But in general, I believe that the Board of Deputies does, when it comes to its various decisions that it makes, represent the majority of the Jewish community.
Wow, that's amazing. Here's a question about something the chief rabbi shared. He shared the story of the coronation, I think in 1189 or something, where it was King
Richard the First.
Richard the First, who the Jews came and they brought gifts in honor of the coronation, and that they actually got, because they weren't invited, they got thrown out. There were pogroms and violence against Jews. Here's a big question, both for your organization and Jewish life in general. To what extent are government relations A, predictable, B, vital for the well-being of a community? To what extent should a community say, okay, let's just focus on our schools, like let's say Satmar does in some cases, or the more Haredi communities say, okay, we're just going to focus on our yeshivas and our students and communities, as opposed to the other extreme where you have communities that focus solemnly on government relations, and so I guess two questions. Number one is, to what extent do you think government relations should be part of the agenda of a Jewish community? And second of all, to what extent do you think it's predictable? For example, you have the case with King Richard where it went terribly wrong.
So the story which the chief rabbi and others have referred to is, of course, a terrible one. As you say, 1189, King Richard I was crowned, and a group of dignitaries from a Jewish community came to give kovod, to give honor to the new king. And I think, as it was recorded at the time, they were stripped and flogged by members of Richard's court. At the same time, a rumor spread, which was not a true rumor. A rumor spread throughout the populace of the city of London that King Richard I desired all of the Jews to be killed, and the Christian population of London, as it was then, rose up and killed at least 30 Jews, burned many Jewish properties, and unfortunately, as well, forcibly converted some Jews. King Richard was horrified when he heard. He killed the main ringleaders of this pogrom, but it was part of the incredibly uneasy relationship between the Jewish community and the Christian community. The Jewish community in England traditionally, we think, began in around 1066, when the Norman conquest happened. King William I came over, and we get the sort of first reports about Jews in England at that point. And then a couple of centuries later, in 1290, the Jewish community was officially expelled from England. I believe that could have been the first such expulsion, actually. And then, of course, we were allowed back in 1656. In terms of the general sort of point about focus on governmental relations, I do think it's interesting, because I think that even when it comes to Satmar or Skver, or I think that although I understand they focus on education, they're certainly not.
They definitely have their askanim and
exactly. There's
yes.
definitely influence when it comes to, for example, I don't know whether so much national, but definitely state politics.
Yeah,
I'm
local
sure.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
they're honestly they're the best. And my wife was a doctor in a large New York hospital, and no group was more appreciative. Every doctor got for Rosh Hashanah a basket with wine, whatever it is. And yeah, look, there's definitely their ability to show appreciation, to connect, to do good PR. No question about that. But the question is, to what extent should that be part of a larger Jewish life? To what extent should politics be even an item on the Jewish agenda? Should it be only education? Should it be mostly education? If it's not education, what is it? What are your thoughts in terms of how important? Now I'm asking the right person because this is your job. So to what extent?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, of course, given that it's my job, I am of course going to tell you that it's very important.
Mhm.
But let me explain why I think it's important. I think that whether it comes to education or whether it comes to, for instance, foreign policy, where when it comes to combating BDS, for instance, or any number of points, I think it's important to be able to have a good relationship with the government of the day, and not just the government. We like, of course, to have a good relationship with representatives of all the main parties if we can, so that if something happens, if there's something terrible, God forbid, happens, or if something important comes up, that we can go to people in the government and say, look, this is what the Jewish community thinks on such an issue. This is perhaps why we support such an issue, or this is why we're worried about the ramifications of such a thing. And there've been so many examples of where that ability to speak to the government about something has helped. So just to give you a couple of examples, during coronavirus, the government completely understandably was forced to bring in emergency legislation to deal with the terrible effects of COVID. And one of the things that we heard was going to be as part of the bill was essentially mandatory cremation. So because there was a huge fear about the sheer number of bodies that were going to, unfortunately, needs to
Mhm.
be well, the sheer number of bodies, the idea was that as part of this bill, there was going to be mandatory cremation. But we swung into action alongside actually some of the other communities, the Muslim community as well, and we worked together with the government, which was very receptive, to ensure that an exception could be made for communities where cremation is forbidden, such as
Mhm.
ours. So that was an important one. Another thing that has come up in the past, which may sound somewhat bizarre to an American audience, was a few years ago there was a small change to an importation rule, and it was coming up to Sukkot, and various Arba Minim importers, because of course England's a rather wet climate and we don't really do
How
esrogim
many
very well.
palm trees?
Exactly, not so many palm trees, definitely not many esrog trees. The esrog importers suddenly realized that they were not going to be able to bring in esrogim, and a bunch of esrogim were basically impounded at the airport. And so the Board of Deputies basically was able, in a remarkably short space of time, to ensure that this particular this particular restriction was lifted, and that essentially enabled the entire Jewish community to have Arba Minim for Sukkot. And without that, that wouldn't have happened. So I think that it's very important to build up such relationships, to be able, when it comes to something like this, or anything else, for instance, to have that understanding from the government and the appreciation of the things that really matter to the Jewish community. And we see that all the time. So, for instance, last month, I was very moved because I was able to help organize an event in Parliament for representatives of all many different Chevra Kadisha organizations around the country. So the different Chevra Kadisha, the burial society organizations, these are all people who give up their time, without any repayment. They're doing this voluntarily, and the thanks that they get is, I feel, minimal, because not to disparage anyone, but of course if people
Well,
have
the
just
dead
lost.
people can't really be
The dead
thankful, right?
people,
That's
you're
what's
right, the dead people can't thank them, and the living people, relatives, are mourning, and
yeah.
so they're not generally thinking about being thankful. But particularly during coronavirus, the pressure that was on the different Chevra Kaddish organizations was immense, particularly during what we think of as the first wave of the pandemic. The Jewish community in this country you'll remember, well, for the UK, the pandemic really hit here about a week or so before Pesach. But
Yeah,
what has
same time as
happened,
New York. By the,
same time
I
as New
think
York,
we had
exactly.
almost 1,000 people dying a day. I think it
Yeah.
was total of 3,000 Jews or so died in the first wave in New York.
Yeah. So exactly, and part of no one knows why exactly, but in the first wave, the Jewish community in the UK was hit harder than the rest of the population. It evened itself out over the course of the entire pandemic, and now there's no statistical aberration. People, it's not entirely sure why. People think that maybe because Purim was a few weeks before and everyone was together, that could have been the reason. But anyway, what happened was the Chevra Kadisha they were under huge pressure, as you can imagine. And last month, I was able to organize an event in Parliament where all the different chevras, or many different chevras from around the country, sent representatives to Parliament, and we were able to honor them there. And
Wow.
the minister for well, one of his duties is for burials. He spoke, and it was extremely moving that we were able to do that. But it's just so helpful, I think, to be able to for a community to talk to people in power about the issues that are going on in our community. And we hear all the time from other communities who perhaps haven't had that traditional sort of relationship and political political experience in that regard, who really admire the fact that we are able to lobby in such a fashion.
Wow. Pretty amazing. And I guess you guys do something also that seems like many communities struggle with. Israel is struggling with this right now, which is bringing different types of Jews together, different types of opinions. It's very unlikely. A few years ago, a friend of mine was visiting whatever was left from the Yemenite Jewish community in Yemen. And I believe there were 14 men left in Sana'a, I think. And they couldn't get a minyan because there were two shuls. There were about 7 Jews in each one. So we have a tendency to take differences of opinions sometimes too seriously. How do you guys bring people together?
It's very difficult. It's difficult everywhere. Two Jews, three opinions. I would say that there is, as with other communities, Jewish communities around the world, there are differences, and sometimes those differences can be strong. The Board of Deputies tries to represent people from across the political divide, from across different denominations, from we for many years we didn't have Haredi deputies because when the Board of Deputies opened up, I think, to reform and liberal Judaism in the 60s and 70s, many Haredim felt that they didn't want to be a direct part of it. That's not to say that we don't work
Sort
closely
of
with
like
them.
a Rav Hirsch type of policy of not
I,
sticking
I think
together.
I think that's probably true. Of course, the board still works very closely with the Haredi community, and we did, in fact, I think a couple of years ago now, we have since reintroduced our first Haredi deputy,
Mm.
and we do work closely, of course, with the Haredi community on many issues. But I would say that it's something that we try and tread with care because for instance, when it comes to Israel, or when it comes to various educational policies, for instance, opinions within the wider Jewish community are, people feel very strongly in different directions,
Yeah.
and we try very hard to tread the middle path, but also to ensure that if we are having discussions, for instance, at these plenary meetings that I mentioned, that people operate in a manner that's respectful to other people's opinions and is designed not to advance sinat chinam, but rather ahavat chinam.
Mhm. Wow. So you guys made headlines when minister, or then he wasn't a minister, a Knesset member, Smotrich, came, and I think you basically showed him the door or the airplane back to Israel. To be honest, at the time, I didn't think it was a good move because I thought he was an elected official. But you managed to solidify and speak in one voice, which wouldn't happen necessarily in other places, which is, I guess, quite extraordinary. And I guess the question that you guys dealt with back then, and many Jewish organizations in America are now thinking of, is how do you remain supportive of Israel? How do you stand with Israel, while at the same time making sure to draw a line of which parts of Israeli politics are just not ones that can be tolerated? How do you walk that line?
It's very difficult, and I think, as you say, a lot of organizations across the world are wrestling with that. The first thing to say is that the Board of Deputies is very, very passionately pro-Israel, and continues to remain that way. We love Israel and we support Israel. I think that that particular incident was an interesting one, because that was an incident where the person in question was coming to Britain and was specifically saying that he was coming here because he wanted to talk to Jewish organizations, and it was felt, I think, by many to advance his sort of politics. And I think that was the primary reason why at that point our organization took the decision to say what it did, because he was
Meaning
coming.
he didn't say he was coming to meet with you. He was saying he was coming to meet with the Jewish community, and then you guys responded.
He said, I think, I could be wrong, but I think he said he was coming to meet with the Jewish community and organizations within the Jewish community. He didn't say he was coming to meet. I don't think he said he was coming to meet directly with our organization, but given that our organization is, a democratic representative organization from the Jewish community, I think it was felt that it was important to set out where we stood. I think that it's there are some red lines in terms of what we think should be acceptable, not just in politics, definitely not just in politics in Israel, in politics in general, and
By the way, I must say it's a shame you guys don't have the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in England, because I think now already 3 Israeli politicians who said they're coming to New York and got very, very little response. Their main meeting was going to the grave of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But yeah, no, even here, I don't know if this was an official thing, but I think when Smotrich came to New York, the biggest meeting, or the meeting that he was saying he has, or said that he's having, is with a synagogue in Long Island, the Young Israel of Lawrence Cedars, which is like super. That's like going to like a really super pro-Israel place. And even they then moved the meeting with him to someone's living room. So, he ended up going to someone's living room in Long Island. But yeah, look, they a lot of the things that you think might be acceptable in your base are not really manageable internationally.
Look, I think that we have a very, very deep love of Israel, and I think that there is a very deep worry from many people who love Israel at the behavior of certain politicians, unfortunately. And of course, I think that everyone, communities around the world, looking on with concern at the situation that has been going on in Israel for a few months now, in terms of the arguments over the judiciary. The Board of Deputies, has not, and I believe will not be taking a public position on that. I think that there are some deputies who are very, very strongly supportive of those protesting against. And there are also some deputies who are very, very strongly pro the government's position on that. And of course, in their personal capacity, they can go out and make their own views clear. But the Board of Deputies as an organization has not taken a specific view on that.
Wow. All right. Finally, last question. You don't need to feel pressure to endorse, but I don't know if you guys are aware that in America, the new national Jewish food is not pizza or anything. It's sushi. The American Jewry has become famous for its various cuisines, Lower East Side restaurants, etc. Between everything going on, has British Jewish culture produced a favorite food? Is there
Sure. No, that's an excellent question. Well, I think it's interesting because I think that the sushi craze definitely caught on within the Jewish community here as well.
Hmm.
Before a few years ago, it was almost unheard of, and then suddenly it was everywhere. So that's definitely very much here. I think in terms of the Jewish community, I think that it's pretty much the same in many ways as in America. You know, we
Hmm.
love our bagels. We love what we call salt beef sandwiches rather than corned beef sandwiches. You know,
Right.
that's very popular. One thing that is interesting though is a lot of people will be aware, I'm sure, that one of the quintessentially British meals is fish and chips. You know, people know that England's famous for fish and chips. Now, traditionally, if you look far enough back, it looks very possible that fish and chips were introduced into this country by Jews,
Oh, wow.
by Sephardi Jews. That the first sort of
Wow.
fish and chips that were sold in some fashion were Jewish in origin. So we can lay claim at least to being the creators or the people who brought in a food that's enjoyed not just specifically within the Jewish community, but very widely within English society.
Hmm. Wow. Okay, Daniel Sugarman, God save the king. And really, thank you for everything you do. Thank you for being an inspiration. We always look at you guys with envy. I hope we get to the same rates of day school enrollment as you guys do. And really, thank you so much. And I don't, what do you wish? Is there like a happy coronation wish?
Well, what we tend to say is God save the king.
God save the king.
Yeah.
All right.
But I wouldn't ask any Americans. I wouldn't force any Americans to say it because of the traditional
I think
traditional
that
allegiances.
I think since Churchill and World War II, the all those tensions have really faded, and the alliance between the UK and the US is pretty strong. So
And we're delighted by that, I can tell you.
all right,
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate it.
thank you, thanks.